Hello everyone, welcome to Shak Horror Stories. Before we dive into the tales of terror, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and hit that like button. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Your comments will significantly help my channel's growth, and I appreciate your support more than you know. Alright, let's dive into the stories. I was 9 years old when my world fell apart. I came home from school that Tuesday afternoon and found Mom sitting at the kitchen table with Grandpa. The moment I saw their faces, I knew something was terribly wrong. They sat me down and told me Dad was missing. He and Uncle Lee had gone hunting that weekend in the woods. East of Ketta, they were maybe half a mile in when Dad realized he'd forgotten his grunt call in the truck. You know, one of those devices that sounds like a buck. He told Uncle Lee to wait right there and headed back to get it. That was the last time anyone saw him, Uncle Lee said he waited 20 or 30 minutes before worry set in. He walked back to the truck, but Dad wasn't there. By the time night fell, Uncle Lee had called in every deputy from McDowell County. They searched those hills for 2 solid weeks. 2 weeks of hoping, praying, waiting for any news. But they found nothing. Not a single trace. Eventually, the sheriff had to call off the search. Mom kept Dad's name on the missing persons list for years. Our whole family pooled money together to hire a private investigator. The guy was good too, a retired cop from Charleston with an excellent reputation. But after months of work, he could only tell us what the sheriff had already said. The most likely scenario was that Dad had wandered into the old mining area near Cucumber and fallen down a shaft. His body was probably still down there, somewhere in the dark. During the initial search, caving specialists had mapped out every mine shaft they could safely enter. Teams with cadaver dogs went through the tunnels that were too dangerous for people. They never found Dad. The sheriff said that didn't necessarily mean he wasn't down there. Those mines were extensive and parts of them had collapsed over the years, but there was something the sheriff didn't tell Mom. She found out later from the private investigator. Inside one of those mine shafts, someone had spray-painted graffiti all over the walls. Strange symbols and words the investigator didn't recognize. He figured local teenagers used the place as a hangout. He thought maybe those kids knew something about what happened to Dad. Despite his best efforts, he never tracked any of them down. Uncle Lee tried to help however he could. He stayed in close contact with the investigator, but Dad's disappearance hit him harder than anyone. People kept telling him it wasn't his fault, that he did everything right, but he was never the same after that day. No one blamed him for it either. How could we? I didn't get the full story until I was much older. The years between Dad going missing and Mom having him declared legally dead were filled with hope and heartbreak. My sister and I kept asking when Daddy was coming home. It nearly destroyed Mom. As we got older and accepted he was never coming back, it got easier to deal with. The pain faded into the background, but it never really left. It was always there. By the time I turned 22, my sister had moved to Morgantown for college, and I was working full-time at a repair shop in Welch. I hadn't seen Uncle Lee in maybe 4 or 5 years. He sent birthday cards and called on holidays. Sometimes he'd phone Mom around the anniversary of Dad's disappearance, but mostly he kept his distance. He once told Mom that I reminded him too much of Dad. Some memories brought him joy, but most brought pain. I understood, but it hurt knowing I probably wouldn't see much of him anymore. So you can imagine how I felt when Mom said Uncle Lee had called asking to talk to me. I drove out to his place near Filbert on a Saturday. What followed felt like a family reunion. We were genuinely happy to see each other. I'd been worried he'd become some depressed alcoholic, but he was clear-headed and doing well. We caught up over sandwiches and beer. The conversation danced around Dad for a while until we couldn't avoid him anymore. Then Uncle Lee made an unexpected proposal. He asked if I wanted to visit the place where Dad disappeared. He said it might give me closure. He'd been up to those hills east of Ketta about half a dozen times over the years. He never found anything, but it helped him feel less useless. At first I wasn't interested. I could see why it helped Uncle Lee. But wandering around where my father vanished sounded like torture to me. I was just happy to have my uncle back in my life. After Grandpa died, Uncle Lee was the only father figure I had left. But slowly over the next year, I came around to the idea. I'd been visiting Uncle Lee every couple weeks, and our relationship had grown stronger. Finally, I suggested we make the trip. He seemed happy but restrained, like he didn't want to show too much emotion in case it scared me off. He never asked what changed my mind. If he had, I would have told him the truth. If it got too emotional, we could just turn around and leave. Nothing was forcing us to stay, and if it didn't help, at least I could say I tried. We planned to go on a Saturday morning in early May. We decided to treat it like a regular hike instead of some dark pilgrimage. We'd bring beer and sandwiches like always. If I felt like talking about Dad, we would. If not, that was fine too. I felt anxious as we drove along the creek toward the trailhead, but once we started walking and talking, I realized these woods were just like any other in West Virginia. I'd always thought of the area around Ketta as haunted. Not literally, but the ghost of my dad felt present there. I'd never wanted to visit as long as I lived. So standing there and realizing it was mostly in my head felt liberating. Mostly being the key word, because some part of me still felt like a piece of Dad was out there somewhere. Call it memory or hope or whatever you want, but I felt something. We walked and talked until we reached Big Creek. We sat on a flat rock and took a break. I figured that was the halfway point, so I suggested heading back. But Uncle Lee said there was something he wanted to show me. After another mile, we came to a rocky outcrop, overlooking the abandoned mines I mentioned earlier. I asked if that was the place the private investigator had checked out. Uncle Lee said yes. Then after a long pause, he told me something he'd never told Mom or me. He told the sheriff and the investigator, but never us. The last time he saw Dad was when he watched him walk into one of those mine shafts. Between realizing Dad was missing and calling the authorities, Uncle Lee had run through the woods calling Dad's name. He wasn't much of a tracker, but he got lucky heading in the right direction. He didn't think Dad would have gone toward the mines. But when Uncle Lee stood on that same outcrop where we stood now, he saw a distant figure dressed exactly like Dad, walking into one of the dark tunnels. Uncle Lee said he scrambled down the steep slope and ran toward that mine shaft. When he got there and walked inside with his flashlight, there was no one. I asked if he saw the same graffiti the investigator mentioned. He said no, but something about that mine made him deeply uneasy. That's what had haunted him all these years. The idea that his brother walked into a dark tunnel, heard his name being called, and chose to hide in the darkness. That was the best case scenario. The worst case was that something terrible happened to Dad in that mine. Something that left him unable to walk or talk or respond. I understood why he'd kept that from us. The situation was bad enough without adding more disturbing mystery. But I told Uncle Lee I was glad he shared the truth, even if it was painful. I figured it was time to leave after that, but Uncle Lee had another proposal. He asked if I wanted to walk down to the mine with him. He said he did it occasionally to try to make peace with that place. I couldn't think of a reason not to. We'd already come all that way, and I had no idea if I'd ever return. Not going seemed like a wasted opportunity. If it helped Uncle Lee deal with the heartache, maybe it would help me too. We walked around the edge of the mining pit to find a safe way down. At the bottom, warning signs were hammered into the dirt telling people to keep out. I asked Uncle Lee if he thought Dad had fallen down a shaft or been trapped in a cave-in. He said if that was the case, they would have found the body by now. Whatever happened to Dad happened in that mine. It just hadn't been properly explained. As we got closer to the entrance, the air felt heavier. Very little light penetrated the tunnel. I remember seeing splintered wooden beams jutting out at odd angles like broken teeth. We didn't say a word as we approached. The place was so quiet that our boots crunching on gravel seemed unnaturally loud. I started noticing things. Discarded tools, a cracked lantern, frayed rope half buried in dirt. Everything suggested the mine had been abandoned in a hurry, rather than through an organized shutdown. I asked Uncle Lee why the place was abandoned. He said he'd heard rumors of flooding, but the official story was that the company went out of business. If that was true, why did it look like everyone ran away? As we reached the entrance, the temperature dropped noticeably. The darkness ahead seemed to swallow all outside light after just a few feet. Uncle Lee sensed my hesitation. He told me I didn't have to go inside if I didn't want to. We could just leave, but I wasn't turning back now. Not after coming all this way. I walked toward the entrance and the rusted cage bars of the open gate beyond. I remember how much colder it got as I stepped inside. The air smelled and tasted of dust, metal, and mold all at once. The outside light disappeared quickly. Luckily, I had a tiny flashlight on my keyring. I fumbled to get it free and pressed the button. The weak beam barely pushed back the darkness a few feet. I took a few steps and stopped, then a few more. I turned around to check if Uncle Lee was following. That's when my blood turned to ice. Uncle Lee stood near the gate, almost a silhouette by then. But there was just enough light to see he was holding something. A gun, and the hand holding it was shaking. For a microsecond, part of me wanted to reason with him. There was a brief flicker of hope that he'd pulled the gun for our safety. But the way it trembled in his hand, the way he said absolutely nothing as I looked at him, I knew I wasn't safe at all. So I ran. I ran down that tunnel with my pathetic little flashlight as the first gunshot exploded behind me. The crack split the air and the bang felt like it destroyed my eardrums. I felt the bullet fly past. My adrenaline surged. To avoid being an easy target, I had to turn off my flashlight. When I released the button, I was plunged into complete darkness. I'd never been so terrified in my entire life. I didn't know that level of fear was possible. The only light came from Uncle Lee's muzzle. Flashes as my lungs burned and my muscles screamed. Any second I expected to take a bullet or slam into a wall. I was headed for a wall. The only warning I got was seeing one of Lee's bullets ricochet off something metallic. I flicked on my flashlight for a second and saw the tunnel splitting into 3 directions. I picked one in a split second and kept running. Only when I was out of his sight did I switch the flashlight back on to look for a hiding place. As I ran, the weak beam bounced off the walls. I realized something had been written on them. At first I thought it was the graffiti the investigator mentioned, but even running at full speed, I could see it was unlike any graffiti I'd ever seen. It looked like writing smeared in black paint. An entire section of tunnel was covered in what had to be over 1,000 lines. I didn't recognize the language. I didn't have time to study it. I was looking for somewhere to hide. I found smaller and larger chambers branching off the tunnel. I picked one at random, lunged inside, and tucked into the nearest corner to hide from Lee's flashlight beam. I kept my breathing shallow, but my heart hammered against my ribs. I realized my hiding place did nothing to reduce my terror. Sure, I was out of sight temporarily, but I was trapped. I tried to stay as quiet as possible. For the first few minutes that felt like hours, my ears rang non-stop from the amplified gunshots. I wondered if my hearing would ever return to normal. I imagined Lee creeping up on me without me ever hearing him coming. It was almost a relief when I started hearing his voice and footsteps getting closer. I wasn't deaf, but I was still trapped. Whatever relief I felt was drowned out by the raw terror of being hunted. Lee started calling my name, telling me to come out. He wasn't trying to reason with me or make excuses, just telling me I needed to come out because sooner or later he was going to find me. I couldn't move. The sound of my footsteps would have given away my location, so I had no choice but to stay still and quiet. That part was surprisingly easy, because running all that way in the shape I was happy to catch my breath. When his footsteps got even louder, he suddenly pointed his flashlight down the tunnel where I was hiding. Staying still and quiet got a lot harder in that moment. I remember repeating it over and over in my head with perfect clarity. Don't come down here. Don't come down here. Please God, don't let him find me. And I guess God listened, because instead of coming down my tunnel, he just kept walking. I thought that might be my chance to escape. If Lee was heading deeper, maybe I could slip out behind him. But that hope died when I remembered how loud my footsteps would be, and how he might not miss this time. I later found a bullet hole through one of my jacket pockets, but like I was saying, I stayed perfectly still in that dark chamber, keeping my ears tuned for his voice and footsteps. They were still ringing from the shots, and I could hear my heart pulsing in my ears, but it wasn't as bad as before. I could hear almost every word Lee was saying as he continued hunting me. His footsteps were slow and steady. Occasionally he mumbled something I couldn't make out. Then suddenly his footsteps went from slow and rhythmic to sharp and quick, with a scrape of gravel, then silence. It sounded like he'd suddenly turned around, like he heard something that startled him and figured it was me trying to escape. He stayed still for a few moments. A horrible silence hung in the air. Then he said, "I know you're here, Stanley." Hearing those words terrified me in ways I never thought possible. Stanley isn't my name. It was my dad's name. My mind felt like it was fracturing from the combination of terror, confusion, and painful memory. Uncle Lee had lost his mind. There was no other explanation. And the reality of what that meant was almost too much to handle. I wanted more than anything to try and reason with him, to appeal to our sense of family. We'd already lost one man. There was no reason to lose another, especially by his own hand. But I knew that gamble might be the last one I'd ever take. He'd already tried to kill me. Nothing said he wouldn't try again. In the end, I resigned myself to waiting until he came around the corner of my hiding place. I'd rush him and try to get control of that gun. Whatever happened next, I could only hope for the best. But as I listened to his footsteps become slow and steady again, waiting for them to get louder before I saw his flashlight, we both heard the sound of something else moving in those tunnels. I can't tell you who or what it was. They didn't say a word. I didn't hear footsteps. All I heard was what sounded like rocks shifting somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Then Lee started to speak. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. He just stopped dead still and started muttering under his breath. I had absolutely no clue what was going on. I was terrified, but all I could do was stand there still as a statue and keep my ears tuned because my life depended on it. Lee just kept muttering to himself. Or at least it sounded like he was talking to himself. Then out of nowhere, I felt this rush of warm air blow through the tunnels, like it was coming from deep underground, and it smelled like evil. When I say it smelled like evil, I only use that word instead of death. I was gonna say it smelled like death, but I've come across a rotting deer carcass in high summer before. This wasn't the same scent. It wasn't that sick smell of decay that makes you want to throw up or run or both. It was something so foul it shouldn't exist by any natural law. It smelled like burning death. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something that can't exist on the surface. Something older than the mine itself. I covered my mouth and nose with my shirt because my first thought was toxic gas. The kind I'd read about that miners had to worry about. I remember thinking, so this is why they abandoned this godforsaken place. As I kept my shirt clamped over my mouth and nose, I suddenly heard Lee begin to yell. I can't guarantee these were his exact words, but to my memory he said, "He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked." He repeated himself a lot. Said stuff in between like please or you've gotta believe me. But he said that first part over and over with fits of rage. His screams got louder and louder until I couldn't make out the words anymore. By the time his yells turned into what sounded like screams of pain and terror, I made a run for it, hoping he was distracted. He wasn't anywhere near my tunnel. I didn't even see his flashlight as I ran, but the whole time I was running out of that tunnel at speeds I was sure would end in me falling. I heard Lee's screams. I kept hearing them as I ran out into daylight. They were much fainter with this eerie echo quality, but I could still hear them right up until they suddenly went silent. I didn't look back. I didn't even consider it. I just kept running toward the gentle slope we'd used to climb down into that pit. I scaled it and kept running through the woods until my legs gave out. The woods were quiet, but Uncle Lee's screams kept echoing in my head. I was overtaken by contradictory feelings of trauma and this bizarre sense of victory. I'd made it out, but I couldn't enjoy that feeling because Uncle Lee hadn't. When I couldn't run anymore, I started walking back to my truck. It took a long time before I spotted the glint of metal through the trees. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. I yanked it open, slid into the driver's seat, and just sat there staring at the windshield. I couldn't process what had just happened. I couldn't feel happy I'd survived. It was just this numb sense of resignation that I had to drive home and report my own attempted murder to the sheriff, along with a single word, why. I could only manage to drive as far as Ketta before I had to stop. There was no way I could drive safely in my condition. It was the first place available to call the sheriff's department. My hands were still shaking when I asked the motel receptionist if I could use their phone. I could tell she was scared of me because of my appearance and behavior, but she let me use it. I didn't try to keep the call private. I lowered my voice, but with her right there, I couldn't keep her from hearing. I told the dispatcher my uncle had tried to kill me at the abandoned mining pit north of Cucumber. I said I thought he'd had some kind of accident and was still inside. I must have sounded completely out of it, but they understood enough to send help. 2 deputies showed up maybe 10 or 15 minutes later. I told them everything. They wrote it all down. They said they'd call me once they checked out the mines. I drove home, took a shower, and tried to process everything. But there was no processing it. Even after all these years, I still haven't been able to. A few hours later, I got a call from one of the deputies. They'd found footprints and shell casings, but no Uncle Lee. What followed was the exact same process as when Dad went missing. The sheriff got search and rescue involved. They explored the mine as deep as it was safe to go. There was no sign of Uncle Lee anywhere. No blood, no body, no weapon. Only those shell casings near the entrance where he'd shot at me. I told them about the rush of warm air and how Lee had started screaming. He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked. After many weeks of investigating and consulting with experts, the sheriff announced their conclusion. In mining, there are things called blowouts or gas blowouts. These involve accidental releases of gases like methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, or carbon dioxide, all of which can build up in mines and prove toxic at certain concentrations. They're caused by things like drilling, blasting, and sudden changes in pressure. They cause poisonous gases to rush out like tsunamis of toxic vapor. The sheriff believed Uncle Lee and I had been caught in one of those blowouts. They explained that Lee was likely hit with a gas cocktail, consisting mostly of highly concentrated carbon dioxide. This led to a frightened disorientation which caused him to attack me in his confusion. Given the circumstances, the sheriff told Mom and me that Lee had become the #1 suspect in Dad's disappearance. There had almost certainly been foul play. There had been no activity in Lee's bank account after he disappeared, which was probably the main reason we all thought he was dead rather than just vanished. It was still possible Dad going missing had nothing to do with what Lee did later. But the sheriff said he was very interested in catching up with Lee to find out why he'd called me by my dad's name instead of my own. More than 2 decades have passed now. Not a trace of Uncle Lee or my dad has ever been found. After the sheriff and his people searched the mine, he ordered it sealed off, with explosives to prevent others from suffering the same tragic fate. Their opinion of what Lee's fate was and my own opinion differ greatly. I didn't make a fuss at the time, and I still don't. What I'm writing now is the first objection I've ever put on paper, let alone voiced out loud. But I don't believe for a second it was some rush of carbon dioxide that made Uncle Lee start shooting at me. I told the sheriff back then over and over that the rush of warm air didn't happen as we were walking in. It happened while I was hiding, right before Lee started calling out for my dad and saying all that weird stuff, and eventually screaming. But the sheriff and his experts acted like I got it all wrong, that I was so disoriented by fear and adrenaline, probably a dose of carbon dioxide myself, that I didn't really know what happened. But I do know what happened to me, and I know what happened to Uncle Lee too. I just don't think I'm ready to actually say it. I don't think I'll ever be ready because doing so feels like opening the door to some great and terrible darkness. I just know there's something out there deep in those mine shafts just north of Cucumber, something that's better off left alone. My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of Anthropology. My research focuses on the intersection of cultural practices and social identity with an emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. In plain English, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and looking at their past. I've undertaken many interesting projects over the years. Most have been both enriching and satisfying, but there's one I frankly wish I could forget. Not because of the subject matter or the people I dealt with. I can't speak highly enough of either, but rather because of a very particular encounter with a very particular woman while researching the Melungeon Appalachians. To cut a very long story short, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the area where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to have a blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries with origins tracing back to the late 18th century or earlier. The term Melungeon comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was applied to those who lived in relative isolation in areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeons remain hotly debated. Theories range from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost colony, survivors to unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee or Saponi. Genetic studies suggest many Melungeons have roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly from early colonial interactions before strict racial laws were established. Physical traits like dark hair, light eyes, and the so-called Melungeon bump on the head have been observed by researchers, though appearances vary widely. Over time, many Melungeons assimilated into broader populations, but these days it's common for their descendants to embrace their ancestry through groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association, who celebrate a complex identity that challenges traditionally rigid racial categories. Undertaking research into the Melungeons seemed like an incredible opportunity. In anthropology, it's rare to get one like that, without a 14-hour flight and a phrase book. I was overjoyed when my proposal was accepted, but if I'd known what I was going to encounter, there's no way in hell I would have honored it. I remember driving along this winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling over gravel as I wondered if it would finally give up before I reached my destination. The latest thread I'd pulled led me to a village called Hollow Ridge. Depending on which map you studied, it wasn't even on some of them. Some accounts made the rather incredible claim that the town's population manifested an atypical aging process, one that defied normal physiological expectations. Or to phrase it like the nice lady at the diner I stopped at said, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time. My notebooks were full of dead ends, so I figured there was no harm chasing that one too. After hours of driving, Hollow Ridge finally came into view. Clapboard houses sagged against the hillside. Smoke curled from chimneys. A few folks lingered on porches watching me roll in. I parked near a general store, grabbed my bag, and stepped out to breathe air that smelled of damp earth and pine. A man in overalls nodded at me from across the street. I nodded back and headed inside. The store clerk, a wiry guy with graying hair, eyed me with suspicion when I started asking questions about the village. I told him I was a genealogist tracking Melungeon bloodlines. He frowned, gave me another look of mistrust, then pointed me toward a dirt path leading up the ridge. Folks up there don't take to outsiders, he said. Better mind yourself. I thanked him, bought a Coke and a pack of gum, then started walking toward the ridge. The path climbed steep and cut through thick woods. My boots crunched on leaves and twigs. It was tough going, but after maybe a mile, I came to a cluster of houses, smaller and older than the ones below. A woman sat on a porch shelling peas. She looked up, her eyes dark and steady. I introduced myself and said I was researching family histories. She didn't smile. She just jerked her head toward the house behind her. "Mama's inside," she told me. She's the one you want to talk to. I stepped up onto the porch. The door creaked open before I could knock. Two men stood there, both tall with weathered skin and white hair. They looked like brothers. They didn't invite me in. They didn't ask what I wanted. They just stared until I explained why I was there. I kept it simple. The slightly shorter man, who had a scar across his cheek, told me, "Mama's 112. She don't talk much. Don't tire her out." The other one nodded. Then they stepped out of the doorway and beckoned me inside. The house smelled of mildew and wood smoke. A dim living room was lit by a single electric lamp in the corner. Lying in a single bed was a woman, or at least what was left of one. When I say she was skeletal, I mean that in the literal sense. Her skin was stretched so tight over her bones that it looked like the slightest touch would draw blood. Her eyes were sunk so deep in their sockets that it made her look ghostly. Her hair hung in thin white strands. Her hands rested like claws by her sides. Her breathing sounded like her windpipe was lined with sandpaper. I'd seen elderly folks before, but she was something else. As I sat down on the stool, one of her sons dragged over. She showed no reaction to me whatsoever. Not a look, not a word, nothing. I started easy by asking her name. When she didn't respond, one of her sons whispered, "Onada." I asked where her people came from. No answer. Her gaze remained locked on the near distance, unblinking. I tried asking about her parents, her childhood. Still nothing. Her sons hovered nearby, arms crossed, watching. "She's weak," one of them eventually said. "Don't push her!" I told them I understood, but my curiosity burned in my chest. A 112-year-old who looked like she'd been starving for decades. I had to know more. I leaned forward, keeping my voice soft. "Ma'am," I said, "how long have you lived for? How have you lived so long? What's your secret?" For the first time, she seemed to latch onto a word. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted. She turned to me with a look of fear on her face. Then in a faint, raspy voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It eats the years." The strain of forcing out those words looked like it was killing her. When she was done, her eyes rolled back. Her body jerked weakly as she began to gasp for air. Her sons rushed over. One yelled for me to get out, while the other tended to his mother. I grabbed my bag and stumbled outside, heart hammering as the door slammed behind me. As I walked back down the ridgeline, the old woman's words echoed in my skull. What in the world did she mean by "it eats the years"? I wanted to go back. I wanted to demand answers. But I knew better than to outstay my welcome in such an isolated place. The woman with the peas was gone, her bowl abandoned. I started down the path with the son's cry of "don't come back" still ringing in my ears. When I got back to my car, I sat for a while, scribbling down every detail I could. The village felt different now, quieter, heavier. As I drove off, I found myself checking my rearview mirror much more frequently than usual. That night, I sat in my apartment replaying the day's events over and over. Onada's face wouldn't leave me, neither would her words. I tried to sleep, but the encounter kept replaying in my mind. When I finally did sleep, I had the most vivid nightmare. I was lying in that bed, more than a century old, croaking the words "it eats the years" in the face of some terrified young researcher. The next morning, I called a research fellow I happened to be friends with, a folklorist who'd written whole studies on Appalachian myths and legends. I told him about Hollow Ridge, about Onada and what she'd said. He went quiet for a few seconds. Then, after clearing his throat, he said he'd heard rumors of a village fitting that description. He'd never been able to confirm them because they never came with many details. Just old folk tales about pacts with the land. He told me such a find might end up being a great source of pride for me. He was excited to read my paper when it was finished. I thanked him, but after I hung up, I found myself even more unsettled than before. As the days went by, I found it impossible to think of anything else. Maybe it was the way my friend hyped me up, but I simply had to know more. About a week later, I drove back to that village, parked my car, and walked down that path again. But when I arrived at the village and walked up the ridgeline to where Onada's home had been, no one was on the porches. The houses seemed empty. I reached Onada's family home and knocked on the door. No answer. I found the door unlocked. My curiosity got the better of me and I pushed it open. The living room was empty. No lamp, no bed, no Onada. I checked the other rooms. Nothing. No furniture or signs of life. I walked back outside and called out. I got nothing but silence. It was like everyone had vanished. Weeks went by. I found myself avoiding my research, but the question still gnawed at me. What did Onada mean by "it eats the years"? It couldn't be literal, right? It had to be a metaphor. But for what? And why did it look like it scared her so badly? I began digging into my books, cross-referencing Melungeon, folklore with anything I could find on Hollow Ridge. I had no luck. Then I engaged with the university's archival resources, including those in the North Carolina collection at Wilson Library's Special Collections. That's where I had a small but very significant breakthrough. One night, while deep in online research, I found an old journal scan dated from the 1700s. It detailed a fur trapper's account of what he called Hungry Hollow. The village he described matched Hollow Ridge perfectly. While he didn't provide much detail beyond the description, he stated very clearly that the place's unnatural temperament meant he'd avoid a return visit no matter the cost. If you assumed my encounter with Onada and her two sons failed to make it into my research paper, you'd be correct. I wanted more than anything to get to the bottom of what I'd seen and heard. But with nothing to reference outside of my own personal experience, doing so would have been fruitless at best and detrimental at worst. So instead of falling down a rabbit hole of a rather spurious nature, I decided the best course of action was to try and forget about it. But I can't forget. No matter how hard I try to rationalize what Onada said to me, there's still something deeply unsettling about the way she acted while saying it. I wouldn't say I've spent a lot of time around the elderly or the senile, not as much as other researchers, but I feel capable of distinguishing the confusion and fright of slowly losing one's mind from the very tangible terror associated with things people believe are real. On that day, in Onada's eyes, I saw real emotion and real fear, and I'm in no hurry whatsoever to encounter it again in the near or distant future. Among the shadowy hollows of 19th century rural Tennessee, a series of terrifying occurrences would come to etch themselves into American folklore as some of the most sinister ever recorded. It was a force of malevolence so palpable, so relentless that it claimed a life, drove a family to the brink of madness, and left a legacy of fear that lingers in the air of Robertson County to this day. But the force in question was no mere ghost story whispered around campfires. She was connected to a woman who actually existed. Over time, her deeds and devilry would earn her the nickname, the Bell Witch. This is not a tale of vague apparitions or spurious sightings. This is the account of a presence so vile it defied explanation. A nightmare that clawed its way into reality and refused to let go. The Bell family, consisting of John Sr., his wife Lucy, and their 9 children, had settled into their sprawling farmstead in 1804. They'd since carved out a life of relative comfort amid the beauty of the Tennessee frontier. For more than a decade, their days were marked by the rhythm of toil and harvest, the creak of wagon wheels, and the laughter of their many children. But in the summer of 1817, everything changed. It began with a knock on the cabin walls, sharp and insistent, like knuckles rapping on the other side of the grave. The family dismissed it, claiming the sound was the result of wind on a loose branch, or perhaps a wild animal. But then came the scratches, clawing at the windows as if something begged to be allowed inside. Night after night, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, until the Bells could no longer deny them. John Bell Sr., a hardy, no-nonsense farmer with a stern demeanor, was the first to glimpse their visitor. While walking through his cornfield one sweltering afternoon, he suddenly froze as a grotesque creature seemingly materialized before his eyes. He saw a dog-like beast with the head of a rabbit, its eyes glinting with an unnatural hunger. In an instant, he shouldered and fired his musket. But as the shot echoed across the field, the creature vanished into thin air, leaving only the stench of sulfur and a creeping dread in its wake. That night, the knocking returned, fiercer and angrier than before. As if the beast had followed John home, the children began to see things too. Betsy, John's youngest daughter, wept as she described a girl in a green dress swinging from an oak tree, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. Drury, one of his sons, swore a bird of monstrous size had flown down and perched atop the family barn before, staring at him with eyes that burned like fire. Over time, the disturbances escalated with a ferocity that turned the Bell family cabin into a place of terror. Furniture shook violently. Bed covers were ripped from sleeping bodies by invisible hands. Chains rattled across the floorboards, dragged by no discernible force. The sightings of strange animals continued. Then came the voices. They were mere whispers at first, hissing through the walls, followed by a raspy, guttural tone that seemed to claw its way up from the deepest pit. "I am Kate," they declared. Suddenly things started to make sense to old John Bell. Kate. Batts had been the name of a deceased local woman, rumored to have once cursed him over a land dispute. Yet whether it truly was her spirit or something far older masquerading in her name, no one could say. What was clear was that the spirit spoke, with a clarity that chilled the Bell family's blood, mocking them, revealing their deepest secrets and taunting them with hints of horrors yet to come. Little Betsy Bell, who was just 12 years old at the time, became Kate's favored target. The witch poured her wrath upon her with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Invisible fists pummeled her fragile frame, leaving bruises and welts that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. Her hair was yanked into knots so tight they drew blood. Her screams were swallowed by the night as the witch's voice cackled in delight. "You'll never know peace," it snarled, pinning her to the bed with a weight no human could lift. The family watched helpless as Betsy's bright spirit withered under the relentless assault. Her eyes grew hollow, her voice reduced to a whimper. The witch denied her any rest. Neighbors flocked to the farm, drawn by tales of the disturbances, only to flee in terror as the witch turned its malice on them. It twisted their insides, causing unimaginable pain. It hurled objects and shrieked curses that echoed through the trees. The witch might have targeted his children for particularly cruel torment, but it was the family's patriarch, John Sr., who bore the brunt of the witch's ultimate vendetta. She vowed to destroy him and pursued her goal with satanic zeal. His health unraveled as the haunting intensified. His tongue swelled inexplicably, choking off his words. His face twitched with spasms that contorted into a mask of agony. His limbs seized as if controlled by some cruel mistress. The witch taunted him endlessly, her voice a venomous hiss in his ears. "I'll take your life, John Bell, and I'll dance on your grave." Eventually, on December 20th of 1820, after 3 years of relentless torment, John Sr.'s body finally failed him. He was found lifeless in his bed, having passed in his sleep. A vial of strange, foul-smelling liquid sat beside him. The family later confirmed it was poison, supposedly fed to him by the witch. The state of Tennessee recorded John's death as the only one officially attributed to a supernatural entity, a grim testament to the power of old Kate Batts and the entity with which she'd compacted. Even Andrew Jackson, the fearless general and future president, proved unable to withstand the Bell Witch's fury. In 1819, he and his men camped on the Bell family farm, eager to confront whatever entity inhabited the place. But as their wagon approached, its wheels locked inexplicably. The air filled with a deafening shriek. "I'd rather face the British Army than spend another night here," Jackson reportedly declared, fleeing before dawn with his troops in tow. If a man of his conviction was left quaking before the witch, what hope did a family of simple farmers have? The witch's reign of terror didn't end with John's death. It lingered, tormenting Betsy and the surviving Bells until 1821, when it abruptly announced its departure. But not without promising to return after 7 years. True to its word, it reappeared in 1828, shaking beds and whispering threats to Lucy and the remaining children, before vanishing again. It vowed another return in 1935, 107 years later. Although no widespread haunting materialized, locals in Adams insist the entity never truly left. Strange lights flicker in the woods, disembodied screams pierce the silence of the night. And the Bell Witch Cave, a limestone hollow near the original farm, still pulsates with an energy that drives visitors to the brink of sanity. Upon visiting the Bell Witch Cave, visitors are greeted by what amounts to a gaping maw. Its jagged walls glisten with slime and damp. The air remains thick with a deeply unsettling stench. Those who brave its depths report footsteps echoing where no one walks, growls rumbling from the shadows, and a suffocating sense of being watched. In 1986, 2 reporters from the Tennessean planned to spend a night inside, armed with skepticism and flashlights. Staff writer David Gerard and staff photographer Bill Wilson lasted mere hours before bolting, driven out by guttural noises that swelled into a roar. A sound no cave should make. It was a short, powerful burst of sound that reverberated from the back of the cave and hit us like a slap, Gerard later wrote. It was not a metallic screech or the howl of wind. It was vocal, loud, high-pitched, a scream. We looked at each other, got through that gate, and quickly left the cave behind us. Logically speaking, we frightened ourselves with our imaginations, Gerard continued. Or someone very much alive and human, frightened us for fun and profit. Those are the reasonable explanations. But on the night in question, with my scalp tingling and my hair rising, our fear seemed reasonable. Common sense. Gerard and Wilson seemed convinced that what they'd encountered was real. But was it actually the Bell Witch? And if so, what exactly is she? Many theories abound. Some call it Kate Batts' vengeful spirit. Others claim it's a poltergeist fueled by Betsy Bell's adolescent turmoil. Yet some believe a demon masquerading as a spirit is to blame. Science offers tepid explanations. Heavy metal poisoning might account for John's symptoms. Mass hysteria seems to explain the rest. Yet such theories fall flat against the hundreds of witnesses, from neighbors to clergy to President Jackson himself, who saw, heard, and felt the Bell Witch's presence. Surely no hoax could sustain such terror for decades, nor would one be capable of leaving such a lasting scar on such a close, knit community. Today the Bell family farm is long gone, but the Witch's Cave remains, a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers and paranormal investigators alike. Every creak of the trees, Every unexplained shadow carries the echo of old Kate Bat's mysterious malice. Locals speak of her in hushed tones, wary of invoking her name lest she turn her gaze their way. The Bell Witch is no campfire tale to be shrugged off at dawn. It's a wound in the fabric of reality, a reminder that some evils don't fade. They simply wait for their next victim. And in the stillness of the Tennessee night, when the wind dies and the darkness presses close, you might hear it. A faint knock, a scratch, or a whisper that promises the tale of the Bell Witch is far from over.